everyone. Nice to see you all. And here we go. This was meant to be a lecture about the history of radar, starting way back then, all the way up to today. Wonderful. The only thing is that anybody that's sort of below the age of about 35, we would never have actually finished it before you probably died at the age of 95. It would have taken that long to have done it. So this is rather a short history of the beginning of radar. And if it goes down well and you think it's all fairly good, who knows? I can do another one, bringing it more up to date to what's going on now. This one goes from the very early days up until just sort of like post-war-ish. So we'll see how it goes, see what you think of it. I can say from the start, and I can't remember who it was I was talking to on the air about this the other day, there aren't any maths, there are no equations, and it's all fairly simple stuff to look at. There will be antennas though, just in case anybody was worried that there wouldn't be. So I'm not going to do anything about radar equations, which if you really want to know about radar, then go start looking at radar equations and fall asleep within 10 to 15 seconds. There we go. Okay, let's get the show on the road. Who invented radar?
German guy.
Thank you, a German guy, yes. And what year did he reinvent it? 1904. Here we are, somebody knows. One Christian Hülsmeyer patents a detection device. There it is. In 1904, he obtained a patent for the detection. And this was basically it. Strangely enough, he bought the patent out in the UK, not out in Germany. But he used a spark transmitter and managed to get signals bouncing off of stuff and come back. But that's his equipment, and that's all there ever was. But it proved that you could send out radio signals, get reflections, and then, if you like, detect those reflections and then do something with it. And interestingly enough, the spark gap transmitter he was using worked on 50 centimeters. So it was, you know, way up high in those days for 1904. You think that everything literally later on shifted all the way down, you know, once you got up to about 10 megahertz or something like that. That was really sort of VHF. So yes, 1904, the start of radar. Christian Hülsmeyer patents his thing called the telemobiloscope. And it's a good job that that's what he called it in English, because if he called that in German, this lecture just would have gone on for about an hour and a half just trying to say that word. So there we go. So, right, Watson Watt was doing other things completely different in 1915, looking at detecting thunderstorms. And he was more interested in direction finding. How many people have got a loop antenna? And how many people call it a loop antenna? And how many people should have called it a Watson Watt? Because he was the guy that invented the loop. What he did was that he had not just one loop, he had two loops. Let's see if I got a picture of that. No, that's not going to worry me because I now got to try and make that go back. I'll come back to that in a minute. At the same time, besides us, if you like, in the UK, the Germans were doing things, the French were doing things, the US were doing things. literally everybody was doing things about radar. And of course, in those days, they didn't know about World War II coming along in 10 or so years' time. So Watson Watt at the time was playing direction finding with his loops. In the US, you had a Mr. Hoyt Taylor and Mr. Leo C. Young also noticed that if you put a radio beam out and the ship went past, you suddenly got an echo. So this was Mr. Taylor and his radio equipment detecting that. And later on, a guy by the name of L.S. Alder took out a patent for naval radar in the UK. We will come back to him in a moment. So, dear old Watson Watt. First of all, there was a write-up about a piece of apparatus developed by Bootman and Pollard, the first official recording UK of the technology for use on coastal defence, which later became Chain Home. Well, we'll come back to that later on. And interestingly enough, because at that time they were messing about with lots of high frequency stuff, 600 megs. And that's quite something, because really the valves that they were making at those times really were struggling up at that frequency. In 1934, the first pulse system was demonstrated in America by the National Research Laboratory in the US. I've actually been there. Then in France, they began developing obstacle locating radar apparatus following studies on a split anode magnetron. We'll come back to the magnetron later on, because besides things about like aerials that everybody sees with Chain Home, there are a number of things allied to the whole business, which, if you like, if they hadn't occurred, radar might not necessarily have occurred at the same time. One of the things that really needed to occur, as they found out, Mr. Watson Watt found out in his early stuff with the DF, direction finding stuff that he was using there, he was using regenerative receivers, which was great because they're very sensitive, but they're not very discriminative, and that was his problem. But of course, along came somebody and invented the thing called the heterodyne, super heterodyne radio in about 1931-32, and that was pivotal on making radar really work. The other thing that came along later on was the magnetron, and one of the other things that came along that was also very important was the cathode ray tube. So those three things literally had to come together at one time to make the whole thing really work as we know today. The main pivot came in February 1935 when you had the Daventry experiment. This was Watson Watt got together a team of people, and they all moved to a place called Bewdley and started to develop a radar system. And that's what really started to make all the changes. So in 1935, you also have the Germany testing surface-to-surface radar. And you've got the Air Ministry under Watson Watt demonstrating a pulse system. Some of the early stuff that he did, they worked out that, yes, there was this, you could send out radio signals and hear a reflection. The big problem was that they were using a lot in the UK, using the BBC transmitters, which were, of course, continuous wave. They were putting a signal out all the time. so that it could then detect the fact that they got a reflection from something. When you try and put that into a radar system, that means you need something really good to send out the transmitter signal and then receive it. They found out that it was better if you just sent the transmitter signal pulse out and then had a gap to receive it and then sent another pulse out. So now you've got a thing going beep, 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 rather than just let's look for a reflection. And the French tested their system out on the ocean liner Normandy. So a whole lot was going on all the time across Europe to figure out what's the best way to do radar. Okay, so here we are, the father of radar, as he's called, Mr. Watson Watt. He began his career in radio physics at the meteorological office, I'll say that again with my teeth in, meteorological office, where he began looking for ways to track thunderstorms. This led in the 1920s to a development of what is known as high frequency direction finding. And as I said, he used his loops to do that. But in 1935, he was asked to comment on reports of the German death ray. So we already know that the Germans were working on sending out big signals to do something with, which we've seen there back in the slide before. It's interestingly enough, because in the late 1980s, I was actually, some people might remember about the Churchill affair, about pipes and everything. He ended up in prison. But what people didn't realise was that the British government had actually put a whole bunch of money into Churchill to develop a death ray. We'll call it a death ray. The idea being is that you could get an aeroplane flying towards you, shoot high intensity radio waves at it, and it would just basically take all the electronics out. And yes, they made one. And it went 40 meters. Which was great, except you wanted to do this to an aeroplane that was about 15 to 20 miles away. Not something you could wheel out on the runway and go zap. So there we go. In 1935, him and his assistant, Frederick Wilkins, determined, right, that they could locate aircraft at long distances. Now, here are two things. This is the Watson Watt loop. Unlike you, which may only have one loop, he used two loops. And he also had a third antenna, which was the receiving antenna. Now, the reason behind this is because they're trying to do direction finding. And strangely enough, when you do direction finding, you don't use the main beam. What you use is the null. And the reasoning behind that is because the main beam is inaccurate. It's wide, huge. Whereas the null, if you get the really good null, could be 40 or so dBs deep. And that was as sharp as anything. So as soon as you were right down at the bottom of the V, of the null, you couldn't hear anything. As soon as you would come up the sidewalls, you could hear the signal. So you knew if you had a signal coming in, suddenly disappear and then come back. Disappear, then come back. And the accuracy of that null was like down to degrees or even less. However, you had to still know that the signal was still there. So you had a dipole there just to make sure that you actually, it was still there and something hadn't disappeared while you were trying to find the null. So that's what Watson Watt did. And as I say, if you've got a loop antenna, you've got a Watson Watt antenna, not just a loop. I mean, everybody goes around in the amateur world saying, oh, well, I've got a G5RV, or I've got a Wyndham, or I've got a this. And yet you go and say, I've got a loop. But nobody ever says, I've got a Watson Watt. So that's the principle. And that is an HF version, if you like, using a 4-element with one in the center. So you can phase each of these and make nulls and so on and so forth. Later on, when we discovered things like computers and make things move very fast, you could phase these with a computer and literally make the whole thing then gyrate round as a circle. I've made a few of those. Okay. So here we are, 1935, secret memo proposed to the Ministry of Aviation and detect the signals. Now the test consisted of 2 receiving antennas located 6 miles away from a BBC shortwave transmitter at Daventry. I said it, you see they're using, this is a high power transmitter. But here's the 2 antennas from a sketch done by Watson Watt's assistant, Mr. Wilkins. The 2 antennas were phased such that signals travelling directly from the station cancelled themselves out. But signals arriving from angles from other ways were then, they could be seen. Therefore, when you saw a signal, you could deflect the trace on a cathode ray tube. So there we go. There's this van. That's the one up there. And here it is as it actually looked. I did find somewhere, I think, a picture of the van and a bit of the test equipment other than that one. But that was the best one I could find. Now, the demonstration was a success, and the receiver showed clear return signals from this thing, a Handley Page Hayward bomber, which was flown around the site at a distance of, at that time, about 16 miles. Then by the time they had worked out that yes, they got something that worked, you can then start tweaking the equipment, and the range started to go up, first from 16, then up to 60, and then later on it got up into just over 100 or so miles. So that was something worthwhile. So the team then produced the first working radar system for themselves, which is called Chain Home. And what the difference was with, if you like, this to this, is that, remember, this is using a BBC transmitter. Now they were transmitting themselves. And the frequency they were using was 26 megs, dear old CB frequency. It wasn't up at the 600, it wasn't up that way yet, it was on 26 megs. And this was the first Chain Home setup. So you've got your transmit towers. So this is the bit that's replacing the BBC transmitter. And interesting enough, here you go. You've got stacked verticals. Sorry, stacked horizontal, up vertical. So this will produce a beam up there like that. Big problem was, as they found out, as soon as the aircraft came down below a few 100,000 feet, they lost them. So they had to put another aerial in down below that filled the hole in down the bottom. Now, I have said to Jeff and Mike that in October, I believe it's going to be, I'm giving another lecture. This lecture is on a mythical, I say it's not a mythical thing. I spent 6 months investigating this. It's a thing called the zeroth null. But strangely enough, they already knew about the zeroth null back here in 1935, 1936, because they had to put this in to cover what they, if you like, created was the zeroth null. It's this array firing out there like that, but if you like, it's firing up in the air, but down here, there's nothing. And this is the area we call the zeroth null. So I'll tell you more about that. Come back in October. So this is the chain home system. You've got a series of offset dipoles, believe it or not. Look, you've got, these are the main ones, and then there's just the counterpoises. Separated from that would be the receive tower. And I'm not sure exactly what antennas they had on that one because they never told me. But you needed both of those. So here you go. This is the two towers, and here's your elevation pattern. And here's your problem down here. They couldn't detect aircraft. The big problem is that if you ever look at modern radars, they all sort of take care of some of this. But you've got an aircraft that is, let's say, at this stage, 50 miles away. Okay, and it's at 30,000 feet. So what angle is that aeroplane at with respect to the horizontal? It's probably no more than about 3 degrees. Obviously, so here you go, look, that aircraft is way out here and he's coming in here. And it's not until he gets in to about 20 or 30 miles that this angle starts to climb up sufficiently that you can actually start to see him. So that's why they needed to add this thing lower down. And then they came in and started to look at other ways of making antenna patterns. And I'll go more into that in October. So here's the setup. Obviously, they've got a phased array in the vertical plane. So you've got narrow beams coming that way. Great. But in that direction, it's all fairly wide. So it's almost literally omnidirectional. So that's your setup. You've got your transmitter going out on the pattern, and you've got this coming back through your super heterodyne receiver, and you're seeing, here's your outgoing pulse and here's your incoming pulse. I know it looks, in real life, it's not as nice and sharp as that, but I've just shown it so that it can be, see, it tends to be very sort of fuzzy and a little bit of a peak comes up and that's it. So you had other things, you've got a timer, you've got to have a timer because you've got to know when this starts and when this comes back so that you can measure the range. Because that's the thing you're obviously trying to find out. So you need accurate timers, and when you send out the pulse, so you know what's coming back and how long by the standard piece of distance velocity equals distance over time type equation, exactly how much that's going to be. So there we go. Interestingly enough, this the receive tower uses a goniometer, and I am not going into what goniometers are because I know someone don't know what goniometers are all about. So we'll leave that one for another day. Okay, so there we go. There's the actual setup. Now, when we're now into a proper system, we can then see all the differences that we've got. So first of all, most systems consisted of 3 masts, not 2, not 1. I mean, yes, you see things like 1 mast, you know, that's only what's left historically. But any station had 3 masts with 2 arrays on. So we've already said that we've got a phased array here and a phased array here in the vertical plane. And then you've got these 2, which are again phased together, so that you can do the next thing that they had to work out. What's the difference? Why need 2? Yes, you can make a beam in one direction, but what's the other thing you can do? If this and this are in phase, you get a beam. You add 90 degrees to it and you get a null. Back to Mr. Watson Watt and his nulls. So now what you've got is a system that not only sends out a pulse on the beam way out, but then it can create a null either side. So you get more accurate direction than you would before, than if you had a nice wide beam like that. And you think, where's he coming in from? Is he coming in from there, coming in from there, or is he coming in from there? You could have it all, you know, could be anywhere. You now put phasing in and you put a null in. So you send a pulse out with in the sum and it gives you a beam. Then you put a pulse out in the difference and you get a null. So if the aeroplane is coming in here on that part of the null and on that part of the null, you know they're over there. And the beam, if it's straight on, you know is in the middle. And if you can make it sort of appear and disappear, and therefore you can improve your accuracy. So there's the 3 main towers. They can be phased. This, I'm not sure about the receive side, but I suspect with the way in which these are set up as a group of 4, that they're more likely to be reacting like an Adcock array. And again, you can phase these around and start moving the beam around. And that's what they had when, if you looked at the station, they actually had a big turntable thing that they used to turn like this. And what that was doing was changing the phase of it wasn't making the antennas turn, it was changing the phase of these things so that they could then pick up which direction things were coming in on. However, as you said before, they're a big problem. Can't detect low-flying aircraft due to, if you like, not only not being able to see them because they're in the null, also because, as they found out, they could start to see buildings and goodness knows what else. But here you go, here's the general parameters. As I said, working on around about 26 megs, and they're using a power of 350 kilowatts, which, well, it sounds daft, at 26 megs, you need a lot of valves. You're using those big glass bottle things that are sort of this size and that round. Get yourself up to 350 kilowatts. Okay, so something had to be done about trying to look for the aircraft that were lower down and to see if we could improve on the various accuracies. So they came up with a thing called chain home low. Now this one worked at 200 megs, and it could detect aircraft up to 100-mile range. And now they're using, because they're up at 200 megs, your antennas are now only this size, dipoles, this size. Great. So we could put a whole load of dipoles in front of a reflecting screen and then push this up into a real, we've got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, possibly 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, 6 element phased array with a reflector behind it. So it could detect things at better range at different altitudes, and it had a small footprint, and so much better than, if you like, the very big rather cumbersome chain home system. But we needed the chain home system because we're now getting up towards 1939, and a guy over the channel decided that he fancied invading England. So chain home was in operation at the outbreak of 1939, and everybody thinks, oh well, yeah, there were train home stations down through Essex and Norfolk and there to stop, but there weren't. They were all over the world, believe it or not. Literally everywhere that Britain had a colony, it had a chain home radar set on it. So it weren't just a matter of half a dozen stations up the east coast of England. We had about 50 around the whole of the coast, including the west coast and all the way up the east coast and down through the south coast. There were about 50 chain home stations. Now, Watson Watt had called his system radio direction and ranging, was what the system was called by us. However, the Americans had also been working on this thing and thought, that's a mouthful of stuff, we don't want that. We will call it radar, for radio detection and ranging. So got that bit. So the Americans cut it down to radar, and of course radar is what we now know today. So we've got all these chain home systems sitting around along the coast, and they're managing to detect all these aircraft coming in. The big problem is that the MOD, or the War Department as it was then, thought, what we need to do is we need to have radar on aircraft. Now, if we got chain home low working on 200 megs, then we can put a 200 meg antenna on some aircraft. We can do that. That's good. So we'll have a couple of dipoles at the front of our Halifax or Wellington bombers, and they should be able to pick up some of these radio signals and radar signals coming in. So a guy by the name of Edward Bowen was in charge of developing a radar that would be carried by a fighter, i.e. at the most, at least a bomber. He decided that the big problem is that the airborne radar should not exceed 90 kilograms, and the transmitter power could not be more than 500 watts, and the antennas needed to be as small as possible because he needed to be able to reduce the drag. So he decided on nothing more than a 1 meter dipole, which basically meant that they could work at 150 megs. Now, the chain home light low was working already at 200, so this was an easy thing to sort of work around and get used to working on an aircraft. So they managed to perfect one by 1940. However, it was still cumbersome. It was still much of a problem. And they thought, nah, this isn't really going to work like what we want it to. It could detect things about 5 or 6 kilometers away. And you thought, by the time I do that, I can use the Mark 1 eyeball to see that there's aircraft coming towards me. So it went into a few aircraft, but not that many. However, along comes the saviour, which is, again, the development of the magnetron, which actually was, again, done over here in the UK. And they developed the magnetron, which had high power, was in the microwave frequency, and basically had everything going for it. So here we go. By the end of the war, they had produced some of the first by the end of the war, of the A1 models, that was the early ones, had been experimented with, but they weren't very well used. However, it's stayed true that, this is a sort of footnote, that AI, or A1, that they were using for the radar, stuck with all the radar's numbers throughout history, such that the more modern 1970s through to 2005-ish Tornado ADVs were still using an AI 24, Mark 24 radar. So it still had the same nomenclature as the ones that were created back in 1940. So, higher power. First of all, we had the klystron, which was, again, trying to sort of excite and amplify signals using cavities. It was useful, but the big problem with it was that it didn't produce quite as much power as they hoped it would do, and wasn't really... So although some systems were made with klystrons, they soon got pushed over for the more useful magnetron. Now, the magnetron actually is not a thing that was invented in the 1940s. It was originally postulated back in 1910, again by someone from the German Siemens Corporation, and they started to work on that, and better ones were then developed by Samuels at the Bell Telephone Laboratories in 1934. Later on, in 1940, Birmingham University successfully ran the first cavity magnetron, which gave out a kilowatt at 3 gigs. This was then developed, and they managed to get it up to 10 kilowatts, and again at 3 gigs. Later, GEC managed to even improve upon that and got up to 25 kilowatts, and later on to 100 kilowatts by 1941, and by 1943 they were closing in on even a megawatt, and that's some power. Now, the important bit is here, 3 megs, which has a wavelength of basically centimeters, 10 centimeters. So half a wavelength is 5 centimeters. We're talking about this now. So we can throw away all our dipoles and all of that sort of thing. And along comes the first small dish antenna, the parabolic dish, not very big. It had a sharp focus beam with a beam width of only 10 degrees. And the thing was, you could put a motor on the back of this and spin it round, which was very useful because now you could point all over the place. And where a pulse came back, you could then make a note of that and say, oh, look, there's something over there, or there's something over there. So this is very useful. So the narrow beam meant that the radar, yes, could only see targets directly in front of the antenna, but by making it rotate, you could cover your full 360 degrees. And remember that we've already got this thing with 1 to 25 kilowatts going in the early stages. And then here's your antenna. It's got a gain of about 30. It's an advertising break. I didn't realise that. I've got to be paid somehow. Right, so you've got something that, the antenna's got gain now, as opposed to a couple of dipoles, which has a gain of 7, 8, 9 maybe. Here you've got something with a gain of 30, plus the fact that you've now got 25 kilowatts going in this, so you've really got intense power going out. Nice narrow beam, and you could now tell where everything was coming from. The only problem is you couldn't have this just hanging around like this on the outside of the aircraft, because as soon as it got up to about 250 knots, this thing would just basically break off and you'd had it. So a new piece of technology had to arise. The radome. So brackets, a nice plastic cover that was transparent that this could then beam through and protect the antenna inside from the elements and the wind blasts. That in its own right then opens up a whole new can of worms of what we call radomes, because radomes, if you remember a little bit of physics about a thing called Snell's law, where if you've got a glass block and you stick an angled beam of light into the glass block, it bends. You've all seen it in ponds and rivers and all of that sort of thing. You all know the basic of Snell's law, which says if you go through a medium, the things bend. And that's what happens in there. It bends. In that one, it's not too bad because, in fact, it's all circular and therefore everything is going always, at least through the front of it, right, is always going through, if you like, a sphere or hemisphere, which means it's always going through at right angles when you're beaming through it. Your big problem at the moment, should you need it, is the thing behind you. Of course, it's not going to behave quite the same because that isn't a sphere. And if you worry about things like that with modern radars, and we go back to something like the tornado or typhoon, the radar is in the front of the aeroplane. And in front of the aeroplane is a nose cone that is this really pointy shape. So if you now try and push a beam through the side of the radome, it's fine. It just goes through the wall, bends a bit, carries on. Brackets, what the hell happens when it goes through that pointed bit? You probably have never worried about that. So the beam starts to go there, does that, and then carries on round. And when they set up a radome, they actually have to physically measure it as it goes through that point, and then into the computer program that's making this thing scan like this, and into the receiver and the transmit. It then puts corrections in so that what actually comes out in front of you looks just like that. But in truth, it goes like that. So there you go. Some of the things about radomes. Okay, so this is a magnetron from 1947, 20 kilowatts peak, and they're getting the frequencies up now to 9 point something gigs, which, if you like, is basically what is now commonly known as the radar frequency. The radar frequency is at 10 gigs-ish. One of the radar frequencies is mostly on aircraft. It's 10 gigs, although they do also go up at 14 and 18 and other things. But this was the start, and a lot of early, particularly aircraft radars, all work out of in what was called the 10 gig band, the X band as it's called in that language. So yeah, I didn't want to go too many of them. If any of you have got boats and you see the Furano and other radars on the boats, the little ones like that and the little sort of things like that, they all work on 10 gigs. Simple, cheap, nowadays cheap, but a lot of that is where that all started back in World War II. Right, so we've got a radar, and we're going out there, and we've got radars on our aeroplanes. Yay! And we can see the enemy out there in their aeroplanes. And the only problem is that we can see our own aeroplanes as well. How do we know which one's them and which one's us? The idea is dead simple. You paint all your aeroplanes pink, which is great, until the enemy decide, hold on a minute, their aeroplanes are all painted pink. We're painting all ours pink. So we still don't know who's who. That's facetious, by the way. We never did paint our airplanes pink. Okay, so we needed a system which got affectionately known as IFF, Identification Friend or Foe. It's a system which basically says, how do I know that that radar pulse that's coming back to us is a friend, our side, or the enemy, their side? Now, a number of different ways. Even Watson Watt knew this was a problem, even when he was doing the very early stuff. He thought, I can detect aeroplanes, great, but I still need to know if there are aeroplanes. I mean, there you are, you've got the Battle of Britain, 1940. You've got loads and loads of Spitfires and Hurricanes whizzing around, and you've got all of the other German aircraft whizzing around, and you've got the radar looking at them all. And they're thinking, which one's ours and which one's theirs? Because if we're not careful, we'll let them come through thinking they're ours when they're not. So we've got to do something. And he said, right, what we can do is we can make ours look brighter than theirs, which worked for a bit of time. But really, it was never going to be a very practical solution. So it was considered back in 1935. They experimented with reflectors consisting of dipoles that were tuned to everything, and therefore, because you had one of the dipoles on your aircraft that was tuned to the frequency that the chain home radars were working on, it would send back a stronger signal than the enemies, because they're only being sent back on just the reflections off of bits of the aircraft. And of course, we think about that now. That's a great idea, except, of course, in this day and age, we have a thing called stealth, whereby you actually don't want to be able to see the aircraft at all. So that worked for a bit, but it was never really going to be a workable solution. So they needed something a little bit more, not sensitive, but something discriminative. And so they think, well, what we'll do is we'll send out a 1 kilohertz tone for 14 seconds every minute, so that we know and we can detect where that's coming from, and we know that that aircraft over there is one of ours. This system is, and they had wonderful names, didn't they, in the Second World War. This one was called Pipsqueak. But it again really didn't work like it should have done. So eventually they came up with the idea that you actually needed a separate transmitter and a receiver on the airplane, and then a transmitter on the aeroplane that would send the signal back. So instead of the 1 kilohertz tone being on the standard radios, you now had a completely separate radio that was going to send back the response. And this was tested as the IFF Mark I. The problem was they started using the same type of frequency as they were using for the radar. And then they found out that that was causing problems with interfering with the radar. So an engineer called Freddie Williams suggested, why don't we put the IFF signals on a completely different frequency from the ones that are on the radar? And they came up with the Mark III, which had specific interrogators and then a specific responder. So this is almost, you've now got the equivalent of a sort of relay station up in space. So you've got a repeater up there that's sending the signal in, and then you send one back. Now, again, the National Research Laboratory in America have been working on an IFF system, and it was using again a single interrogation frequency like the Mark III, but it differed in that it used a separate response frequency. So now you've got something else that's happening. So again, it's a bit like a repeater. You're sending it out, the interrogator signal goes out on one frequency, and then when you want to respond, you send it back on a close-ish, but separate frequency, so that you're not ending up with the two interfering with one another. So the response, what you needed to do is that the incoming signal from your interrogator triggered the signal to send it back by the repeater. So a lot of work was done on that, and eventually they came up initially with the Mark V. That was done at a lower frequency, and then more latterly, by 1948, they had started going up to what is now known as the IFF frequency, which is 1030, 1090. So it's 1030 interrogate, 1090 response at 1 gigahertz. And there are tiny little antennas that if you ever go and look at a military aircraft, you'll still see IFFs on there. And they're little antennas, they're about that high. Little black things like triangles. That's all they are. Okay, and they started testing this in 1948. Eventually it ended up with what is known as the Mark 10 IFF. And believe it or not, the Mark 10 IFF, first developed in 1948, lasted well up all the way through till Operation Granby in 1990, which was the invasion of Iraq. And the reason being is because the Americans, who were responsible for it all, had developed the thing called the Mark 12. I was involved in the development of Mark 12 through 1985 through to 1987. So I know a lot about what that was all about. And unfortunately, the Americans sort of turned around and said to the UK, which was still using Mark 10, no Mark 12, therefore hostile. So suddenly the UK, who were helping the Americans, you know how we like to help the Americans whenever we can. So we suddenly had to go and start making Mark 12s. The only real difference, the frequency hadn't changed. All that had really changed was the way in which they encode all the signals to make it all work. So there we go. So nowadays, we now use IFF is Mark 12. Of course, on commercial aircraft, they have their equivalent. It's called TACAN. And so when you look at an air traffic control radar display and you see the little dot, and next door to it, it'll tell you that it's BA 1234, right? That BA 1234 is there through the TACAN system. It is not there through, or put it the commercial IFF system. They're friend or foe, they're all friends. But it works on exactly the same sort of system. And that's it for the moment. So I hope that sort of entertained you for 5 minutes. And for the rest of you that fell asleep, you can all wake up now and get another cup of coffee. But if there are any questions, please put them into a stamped address envelope and post them to somewhere in Derby or Yorkshire. Yeah, Keynsham, yeah.
Safety issues when magnetrons came out. I mean, there must be an inflatment for a lot of the technicians at that time.
Were there safety issues? I think the answer to that question at the time during the World War, the answer is I don't think they really worried about it. The thing about the airborne radars, if you like, is that they're never used really on the ground. There's no point. So you don't switch them on until they get up into up in the air. In which case, then there are no issues. You're not going to suffer particularly. One interesting thing that I did hear about was that one of our Wellington bombers with a modern radar, well, the 3 gig radar on it. One of the things about the when they started to put the radars onto the bombers was that you had the box, which was the radar, and all the way around it was about a couple of pounds of TNT. Basically speaking, because if you crashed your aeroplane, or if you landed your aeroplane in a hostile foreign country, they didn't want them to find out the technology that we had. So the idea was, you crash landed and your aircraft was still reasonably well intact. You then had to blow up the aircraft, the radar, before you left the aircraft. So that was something. Now, the thing was that one Wellington bomber.
On question of safety, and it was on shipboard because we didn't have the problem with the aircraft because we could use as much power as we like. So many of the big military radars and ships, we're talking tens of megawatts. So before you went aloft to go and service your little HF dipole, you had to get safety transmit keys out. They switched this on when you were up there. And
Yeah. You used to learn a thing about called. Yeah. You quickly learn about a thing called the man aloft key. If you were going up on the upper decks or up one of the masts, and I've done that, as Don says, you went to this rack on the wall, you took the key that was the radar key, and you put that in your pocket so that nobody could then come and switch on the radar if you were up there. Or conversely, if it was on and working, you went over to the radar system and you switched it off.
I actually had first-hand experience of that, because when I was an apprentice initially in the shipyard, one of the jobs I ended up doing quite a lot was going up and doing navigation lights and things like that. And it was very often the nav lights were up on the top of the radar mast. And I remember I was up and off one particular time. I didn't know about the man and off keys and everything else like that. We didn't even think about it. They just literally had us up on a crane basket, smoking alongside the mast, and we just carried on with what we were doing. And I remember being up there one particular day, and I heard this bellow from the top of the bridge down below me. And all I heard bellowed up was, "Oi, Sparky!" I looked down. "Yeah, you want kids?" "Why? Perhaps later on in life, why?" He said, "Because I'm about to run the big radar. If you don't come down, I'm going to fry your knackers." And that's where I learned we did have a little bit of respect for radar. We came down, and then they started running this thing up. So yeah, it was good fun.
Anybody, I mean, we're in the anniversary of 1980, whatever it was. Anybody remember the Falklands War? And we lost HMS Sheffield. It was hit by a big Exocet missile, which HMS Sheffield was quite capable of detecting well in advance and basically shooting them out of the sky. No problem at all. However, HMS Sheffield got hit by an Exocet missile and really ended up in quite a bit of a mess. And the reason why it got hit was because they didn't detect, the radar didn't detect the incoming Exocet missile. And it didn't detect it because why? Because Mr. Woodward, Don laughs, he knows about this, wanted to talk to the captain of the Sheffield. And the way they did that was using SATCOMs. And the SATCOM frequency for Skynet is in the 7 to 8 gig band. And whenever they use SATCOMs in the 7 to 8 gig band, it wiped out the 10 gig radar. So when they wanted to do SATCOMs, they turned the 10 gig radar off. And therefore, Sheffield was completely and totally blind to incoming missiles. And lo and behold, one came in and took out Sheffield. That's exactly what happened to Sheffield. And it was due to the fact they switched the radar off because they wanted to do SATCOMs. So there you go. The thing about radar is, it's when you said about safety, that there are many aspects to it. And again, one of the interesting stories is British Aerospace in the mid-80s decided to build a lovely brand new building called the Space Building. The money was put up by one Margaret Thatcher because she wanted to develop a satellite to put up in space that the Americans wouldn't know about, right? And so she got this money and she built the building at British Aerospace ready to build satellites. By the way, they used to build satellites at Bristol, believe it or not. They had a whole, as well as, I know they build them at Stevenage and at Portsmouth, but they also used to build them at Bristol. Anyway, she put up the money and built all of these buildings. They were highly secure, very secret. A secret to let you know is that even the cleaning ladies had to be secret cleared. They had to have high level of clearance just to go and do the cleaning. There was a swimming pool in there. I call it a swimming pool. It was sort of like 50 feet deep. And the idea behind the swimming pool, if you like, is that it's zero gravity. That's what you test things in, or down here on Earth. It's like when they test the astronauts. When they want to test the astronauts doing things, they put them in a big swimming pool with their same gear on that they would be if they're out of the spaceship. So they go down into the swimming pool, and they're now basically zero gravity, non-buoyant, totally floating around. So it had all of that in there. And on one of the buildings, they decided they were going to put the director's suite. And the directors like to look over their domain, so they put it on the top floor. Wonderful, lovely, lovely vista. However, at Felton, 250 yards away, meters away, yards away, whatever, there just happened to be this 10 megawatt radar system that basically is the air traffic control for the whole of the UK aircraft going north to south. All the aircraft, because if you may not be aware, but the main north-south corridor basically almost sort of runs over, shall we say, the top of us and then runs up the west coast. And the reason why it does that is because all the main airfields, such as Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted, Luton, are all over there. So all the north-south traffic comes up the west coast. So Filton had the radar, and it used to track all of the commercial aircraft going north-south. However, you've got a 10 megawatt radar with a great big reflector antenna with a gain of best part of 50. And it just happened to sweep past this wonderful director's floor. So now they put the secretaries in, and all the secretaries start typing away on their nice little brand new computers. Me. Except every time the radar went past, the whole computer's locked up. Talk about death rays. This was the equivalent of a death ray. It was basically just locked the computer. So the secretary started complaining. We don't understand. Our computers keep locking up every so often, and we can't do our work. So our department, which was responsible for radio interference, got called in. So off us little engineers wander over, and we've got our sort of sniffer thingies in our hands, and we're up on the top floor, and got all this lovely wood paneling in the boardrooms, and everything costs like Mr. Trump's ballroom. It costs a fortune, right? And then we're standing there with our sniffers, and every so often the sniffer would go whoop, whoop, whoop. Oh, it's the radar. And you start looking at the signal that this thing, and suddenly it shoots up like this huge signal. You can't stay here. It's too dangerous. You're going to be irate. If you're going to sit here for 8 hours typing away on your thing, you've got this, all the things that we have to do now with our EMC, etc., and telling everybody that we're not allowed to transmit more than 5 watts, otherwise we'll all get fried. So all of these secretaries were up there getting fried every so many seconds. So they had to move everything now, the whole paneling, literally had to take the whole of the top floor down and move it down to the ground floor, where of course because it's all on a hill, it was below the hill level and you couldn't see it, and it was clear. But now you've got a building with a top floor that's completely empty, other than the fact that they just store stuff in it. It's a storage room now, but it was all... Anyway, the whole satellite project, by the way, as a matter of interest, got cancelled because Margaret, who happens to be a Conservative, had a rival. His name was somebody nobody's ever heard of, by the name of Peter Mandelson. Got wind of the fact that she was going to build this secret satellite without telling anybody that he was doing it. And he blew the whistle, and the whole thing got cancelled. And you got this set of buildings that were worth millions, complete with a swimming pool, etc. Knowing what we know now about Mr. Mandelson, it's interesting to note why he blew the whistle, because basically speaking, from the UK point of view, it was a good idea that we had our own brackets secret satellite, and yet he blew it. So there you go. That's another story about radar more than anything else, as a bit of an aside.
Have you read Skip Wilkins' book? Mr. Wilkins, who was What's and What's Found.
No.
The RSG.
I have seen it, and I have looked at, yes, and I think it is a good, it's a good read.
It's a good read.
If anybody is really interested, if you're really interested about what radar is about, the Bible is called Skolnick. However, unless you've got a degree in ultra high mathematics, I would just leave it, because it is full of lots of mathematical equations that even I don't fully understand. So, but the Bible is Skolnick, but it's got everything in it about the way in which you do antennas, you do phasing, you do this, that, the other, and so on and so forth. But as I said, I'll do another chat, bringing you up to speed with all the modern stuff in radar. So phased arrays, and all of the other things that exist now, that, if you like, we finished at around about sort of 1950, at the end of the war, 1950. And really after that, things progressed in lots of different ways, and certain things had to be worked out, just as Don said, and I said about the radar band at 10. So the radar bands sort of go 1, 3, 10, 14, 18. I think there's one in around 25, and then they go up, because you're now including all the things that are in missiles. And I mean, there's some interesting things that they do in missiles with missile radars. If you've ever looked at the what's called the absorption curve, anybody ever looked at a thing called the absorption curve? No, right. If you're walking down in HF, you put a radio signal through the atmosphere and nothing really gets lost. It's however, as you go up frequency, right, the amount of radio absorption increases, which is why if you get into microwave, you have to start doing calculations, which is what I've done a lot of my life, about free space path loss, right? So if you're going up to a satellite, you have to calculate the free space path loss, and it's higher, right, when it's through the atmosphere than it is through space. And if you look at the absorption curve, you get to 60 gigs, and it's a peak, and then it drops down, and then it climbs back up like that. But this peak that comes up there and drops down there, this is all to do with the excitation of, I think it's the HO bond. In water, there is a bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen, something like that. And it resonates like that, the two of them, oxygen, hydrogen, doing that, okay? So this bond between is a certain length, and that radio wave gets absorbed by that bond to make it do that even more, okay? And because of that, and it's absorbed it, then the radio waves don't pass through. That means to say, if you now make a radar at 60 gigs, it doesn't go very far because it's in the absorption band, which is, if you like, the last thing you want, except if you don't want to be detected. So You put a 60 gig radar in there, and you only turn it on at the last moment, if you like, when you're sort of kilometre or so away from your target, and you're travelling at twice the speed of sound, by the way. You're at 2,000 miles an hour, right? Switch it on, suddenly it illuminates the target. Poof, I see the target, great, and then goes and hits it. But until you've switched it on and you're in 60 gigs, it's very difficult for the person to react in time. So that's one of the things that it's also one of the regions where they use 60 gig radars on self-drive cars, not self-drive, but pilotless cars. Why? Because the radar doesn't go very far, which is what you want. Obviously, if you've got a car 200 yards ahead and you've got your radar pointing at it and it can't see the car ahead, because your radar says, no, there's nothing there, nothing there, nothing there, because of the absorption. When that car suddenly brakes and stops, then suddenly you come into the range of the radar, it sees it, slams your brakes on and you stop. Move away again and the radar doesn't see it, so it doesn't react to it. So it's used in driverless cars, 60 gigs. And they also start to use, coming up here at 90 gigs as well.
I've got one for you.
Go on.
So, if you could sort of explain it in some very, very simple terms for people, because it's something that probably a lot of people that have used HF radio, I think, have come across at some stage, and that is the over-the-horizon radar, the woodpecker. It's just basically that ding, 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 ding.
The woodpecker, we've had over-the-horizon radars. There was one based at, down in South Wales. It's not only the Russians that had over-the-horizon radars. The Americans have got it. We've got one, or we did have one. And to be honest, they never worked. Never worked. The only thing that they could actually detect was basically sea waves and the direction the sea waves were moving. But to actually detect an object at so many hundreds of miles away on the sea, it never really worked. They couldn't tell whether or not, yes, it was a real thing or it wasn't a real thing. So it was basically a complete waste of time.
So why is it still being used? Because we still hear it on HF. It's an American company.
They still use them, and but
all those things you see sweeping up and down, they're all OTHR.
Yeah.
But it's mainly used now as meteorological.
Yes, I was just about to say that. They're meteorological things because they can detect ocean currents and wave movements, but they can't detect. You can't stick even a big aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean, use over the horizon radar, and then say it's there. It just don't do it.
Yeah, they built all those on the Russians.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember the noises on the radio, the interference.
One of the things which is far more exciting than really over the horizon radar, or everything that we've seen so far is used what everybody, if you like, understands with radar, which is pulse radar. Pulse out, reflect a signal back. Boom, out, back, fine. There's a company out in Cambridge called WSJT-X, and it makes FM radar, right? And basically speaking, it sweeps an FM frequency up and back, but it's on all the time. And the picture that you get back is like looking at a black and white photograph. So much so that they tested it on an airfield out in Cambridge, and you can actually see rabbits running across the field. It is used, it can only detect up to about 4 or 5 kilometers at most. It is not, you know, it's not something that can detect things all the way, but it is used a lot in security radar, where you can put them on towers and look at the screen. And as I said, it's like looking at a black and white photograph. And if somebody is walking across the front of it who shouldn't be walking across the front of it, then they can then do something about it. But yeah, it's used in a surveillance, security surveillance system. So that's FM radar. But as I say, I'll go into some of all that in a talk later on. So, any more questions? Quite happy to answer things. Okay.